Is this really the result of the so-called climate change? Or is there something else at play? I am talking about terrible weather phenomenon we have been observing all over the world during the last 2 to 3 weeks' time. From Germany to Belgium to Italy, from Europe all the way to China, to Turkey, to northern parts of America, to the southern parts of America, from there down to India, all over the world, major floods, unheard of rainfall, sandstorms, hailstorms are causing beyond imagination and beyond calculation damage and destruction to the human lives and properties of people all over the world. Of course, the scientists and the politicians would like you to believe that all of this is because of the so-called climate change which they have been heralding for a long time. They only want you to switch from using oil reserves as energy and switch to so-called green energy. They want you to pay more taxes. They want to cut off more of your freedoms so that they can tackle the climate change. And they can stop all these storms and floods and destruction. But now, I beg you a question here. Is it really true? Is this really true? Is there really something called a climate change, so that a climate change which they can control and stop at their will? Or is there something else at play here? What about the judgment of God? Could it be that all these things which are happening simultaneously all over the world, could it be that it is God's shouting of warnings for very terrible wrath and judgment that is soon approaching, fast approaching? Now I want to show you 3 major examples of how God used weather phenomenon, extraordinary, unheard of, unimaginable weather phenomenon, to bring His judgment upon rebellious world, upon rebellious people, people who were obstinately rebelling against God. First, I want to take you to the flood, as we find it in Genesis chapter 7. This is the time where God decided to destroy a whole global population of corrupted DNA Nephilims and all their counterparts, which they produced by corrupting human DNA with demon and animal DNA. And God's response was to send this unheard of, unimaginable flood. And did you know, it rained night and day for 40 days. The whole world was flooded over 150 days. And as it is recorded in Genesis chapter 7, all living and breathing flesh on earth was killed in that flood. And the second one I want to show you, before I go to the second one, there is this, of course, there's this beautiful detail there that God found in the world this righteous man, Noah, and his family, who still had, I believe, the pure human DNA. And God saved them by putting them in an ark, together with the pure DNA animals, putting them in an ark, closing the door of the ark, 7 days before God flooded the earth. They had to sit in that ark for 7 days before the flood came. And after that, for 150 days, they were still in the ark, while every living and breathing flesh who rebelled against God was drawn into their death. God saved the righteous ones. That is the most beautiful detail. I'm going to come back to that detail later on. Now I want to jump to the next example of God's judgment coming in the form of terrible weather phenomenon. That is in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah. That you find in Genesis chapter 19. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, God destroys these 2 civilizations, these 2 established, big, developed cities and all their inhabitants. God destroys them by raining down brimstone and fire. Never mind raining down water. Now God is now, in Sodom and Gomorrah case, God is raining down brimstone and fire destroying everyone except a family who was found righteous in the eyes of God, who did not partake in all the evil deeds of these two civilizations. God took this family out, literally, by giving them warning the night before, sending his angels to warn them and pull them out of the city. God sent his angels to take them out of the city so that they shall not perish with the rest of the city. And God said to them, until you get to a safe distance from here, I will hold my judgment. But once you are at a safe distance from here, I'm going to pour down brimstone and fire on them. And that is exactly what God did. God destroyed them by raining down on them brimstone and fire. Isn't that a weather phenomenon? How can you explain that as climate change? Tell me that story. Now I'm going to take you to the next example. The next example is something that has not yet happened. It is written in great detail in the Bible prophecy. We know how it will happen before it happened. In fact, the prophet Ezekiel wrote it hundreds and hundreds, in fact thousands of years before it happened. It didn't happen yet. We are going to Ezekiel 38, where Ezekiel writes about how God will destroy Gog and his armies because they came to destroy God's people Israel. And guess what? How will God destroy them? God will destroy them by flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. You find that in Ezekiel 38 verse 22. You see, God is in control of every detail of the universe, but especially He is in total control of the weather. God dictates the weather. Weather obeys every word of God. And God uses weather to punish those who rebel against Him. Now, let me take you again back to our current day and moment. All over the world, we are experiencing terrible weather phenomenon. And I believe this is God speaking to the world loud and clear. I believe this is not yet God's judgment. All these trouble, floods and storms and tsunamis we are experiencing more and more frequently, this is not yet God's judgment. These are only God's shouting or warnings. God is warning the world. God is trying to warn the people of the world. God is saying, I am in control, guys. Get a little sanity here. God is in control. God dictates the weather, and God is not happy with the direction, with the course of direction the global population is taking. God is slowly and surely warning the world. One day, before God pours His final 7-year judgment on earth, just before that, God will take His people, His righteous ones, out of this world. Just as God did in the case of the flood in Genesis chapter 7, just as God did in the case of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. Now in our days, just before God pours His terrible wrath on earth, God will take His righteous ones out of this world. And we know that from the words of Jesus in John 14 verse 1 to 3. Jesus will come to take His people from this world before God pours His judgment on them. Therefore I say, turn your eyes on Jesus, fix your eyes on Jesus, get right with God, because God's terrible judgment is coming for this wicked world. But before that, Jesus is coming to take His people out of this world. May you be among those who will be taken out by Jesus. God bless you and goodbye.